In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became a popular way for young people in America to get around. Hitchhiking involves getting rides from strangers, often by standing on the side of a busy road with your thumb out, signaling that you need a lift. Today, the idea of getting into a stranger's car or picking up someone you don't know seems incredibly dangerous, but back then, it was widely accepted as normal. With this context in mind, let's go back to September 29th, 1978. A 15-year-old girl named Mary Vincent found herself on the side of a highway just outside Modesto, California, not far from San Francisco. Mary was a rebellious teenager who had recently run away from her home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were in the midst of a bitter divorce, and she couldn't bear being at home anymore, so she fled. She made her way to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. But after only a few days, Mary became overwhelmingly homesick and wanted to return to her family. So one day, when her grandfather was out, she snuck out of his house and began hitchhiking back to Las Vegas. Mary had already managed to hitchhike from Los Angeles to Modesto, where the first person had dropped her off. Now, she was on the side of the highway in Modesto, looking for another ride to take her further south. She wasn't alone. There were two other young hitchhikers with her, and they all held signs that read "Going South," hoping to attract a willing driver. As they stood there, a light blue passenger van pulled over a short distance ahead of them. It was driven by a man in his 50s who seemed harmless enough. Mary ran up to the van, peering through the rolled-down window on the passenger side, and asked the man if he could give all three of them a ride. But the man insisted he could only take Mary, not the other two. This puzzled Mary because the van had plenty of space for all three of them. She tried to convince the man to take them all, but he remained firm, stating that he could only take her. Feeling conflicted, Mary returned to her companions to explain the situation. They advised her against getting in the van, sensing something was off. But Mary was desperate to get home. The thought of waiting hours or even days for another ride was unbearable. So despite her reservations, she decided to take the risk. After saying goodbye to her companions, Mary grabbed her bag and ran back to the van, climbing into the passenger seat. As soon as she shut the door, the man pulled back onto the road and introduced himself as Lawrence Singleton, a 50-year-old man. Mary introduced herself in return, and the two began making small talk. Lawrence's demeanor reminded Mary of her grandfather. He was polite and seemed kind, so she started to relax. When Mary began to feel tired, she asked if it would be okay to sleep for a while, and Lawrence assured her it was fine. She curled up in the seat and soon drifted off. But when she woke up a little while later, she quickly realized they were heading in the wrong direction. She pointed this out to Lawrence, who apologized and promised to turn around. Although Mary couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an innocent mistake, she decided to keep quiet as he did indeed start heading the right way. However, Mary remained on edge. They were now traveling through a remote, wooded area with very little traffic. Lawrence suddenly mentioned that he needed to stop and use the bathroom, pulling off the highway. As Mary looked down, she noticed one of her shoes was untied. Instinctively, she felt the need to tie it, just in case she needed to make a quick escape, but she hesitated, not wanting to draw attention to herself in the confined space of the van. So Mary thought to herself, as soon as we come to a stop, I'll step out and tie my shoe. But instead of simply pulling onto the shoulder of the road, Lawrence turned onto an access road that led into a dense forest. As the van moved deeper into the woods, Mary's sense of unease intensified. She knew something was terribly wrong, but she wasn't sure how to confront Lawrence or whether she should just run. Her mind raced with possible scenarios, but before she could make a decision, Lawrence pulled the van to a stop deep within the forest, far enough from the main road that no one could see them. Lawrence stepped out of the van, supposedly to relieve himself, and Mary quickly followed, bending down to tie her shoe. But before she could finish, a sudden, forceful blow struck the back of her head, and everything went dark. Lawrence had hidden a hammer next to his seat, and instead of going to relieve himself, he had circled the van and attacked her. When Mary regained consciousness, she found herself in the back of the van, her body tied down. She could see the forest outside through the windows, confirming they were still deep in the woods. Her head throbbed, and as she tried to move, she realized she was completely restrained. Before she could fully process what was happening, the van's back doors swung open, and Lawrence climbed inside. Without a word, he began to assault her. Mary was a 15-year-old girl, terrified and powerless against this man. She quietly begged him to stop, promising she wouldn't tell anyone if he let her go. But her pleas fell on deaf ears as Lawrence continued his assault for hours. Finally, exhausted, Lawrence climbed out of the van and went to sleep in the front seat, leaving Mary bound and helpless in the back. She tried in vain to free herself, but the restraints were too tight. All she could do was lie there, dreading what might happen next. Sometime during the night, Lawrence woke up. Without a word, he started the van, drove out of the forest, and onto the main road. After driving for a while, he turned down another secluded access road, far from prying eyes, and stopped the van again. This time, they were in a desolate canyon, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. Lawrence climbed out of the van, opened the back doors, and dragged Mary out into the open. She was beaten, bloody, and barely conscious, but she still managed to weakly beg him to set her free. Lawrence responded, "Oh, you want to be free? I'll set you free." With those chilling words, he walked to the back of the van, retrieved a hatchet from a toolbox, and returned to Mary. She had only a moment to comprehend what was happening before he grabbed her left arm and, in one swift motion, brought the hatchet down, severing her arm just below the elbow. Mary fell to the ground, staring in shock at the stump where her arm had been. But Lawrence wasn't finished. He grabbed her right wrist, and as Mary screamed and kicked, trying desperately to fight him off, he swung the hatchet again and again. It took 4 brutal strikes to completely sever her right arm. Mary was left lying on the ground, bleeding profusely and screaming in agony. Lawrence, meanwhile, was fixated on the bizarre sight of Mary's severed hand still gripping his arm. Nonchalantly, Lawrence shook the hand off his arm before turning back to Mary, who had gone silent, her body limp in a growing pool of blood. He put the bloody hatchet back in the van, then returned to Mary's side. Dragging her by the feet, he pulled her across the rough ground until they reached a nearby culvert, a large tunnel running under the road to allow water to pass through. The opening of the culvert was about 30 feet below the surface of the road. Without any hesitation, Lawrence tossed Mary's limp body over the edge, where she crashed onto the rocks below. Thinking she was dead, Lawrence carefully descended to the bottom of the culvert, stuffed her body inside the tunnel, and turned to leave. As he walked away, he said, "Now you're free." Miraculously, Mary was still alive. Despite the unimaginable pain, the blood loss, and the trauma, she hadn't died. She would later recall the entire harm with horrifying clarity, remembering every detail except for the moment when the hammer had first struck her. When Lawrence went on to sever her right arm, despite the excruciating pain, Mary's survival instincts kicked in. She knew she had to pretend to be dead if she wanted any chance of surviving this ordeal. She went completely limp, her eyes half open, and watched in eerie silence as Lawrence flicked her left hand off his arm. She remained motionless as he dragged her 100 feet to the culvert and threw her 30 feet down onto jagged rocks below, breaking 4 of her ribs in the process. The pain was overwhelming, but her will to survive told her to remain silent, to endure the agony. After Lawrence left, Mary's thoughts were consumed by the possibility that he might still be nearby, waiting to finish what he had started. She knew she couldn't risk crawling out of the culvert just yet, fearing he could be watching. Despite her contorted position, with no arms and broken ribs, Mary's willpower kept her going. She began to feel an overwhelming sense of fatigue, a clear sign of severe blood loss. But a voice in her head urged her not to give in, reminding her that if she died, her attacker would go unpunished, and he would continue his reign of terror on others. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Mary made the decision to survive. She knew she had to escape, even if Lawrence was still up there. Somehow, she managed to crawl out of the culvert. Once on the ground, she used the stumps of her arms to dig into the dirt, attempting to pack the wounds with earth and mud. Then, she raised her mutilated arms above her head to prevent further blood loss. With her arms raised and her body in shock, she climbed up the embankment to the road. Partly ragged, covered in blood, and barely conscious, Mary began to run down the highway. Despite her horrifying appearance, the first car that passed was so shocked by the sight of her that they didn't stop. Undeterred, Mary continued running for 3 miles along the highway until she finally managed to flag down a passing motorist, a young couple who, after their initial shock, rushed her to the hospital. Mary spent a month in the hospital, where she provided the police with detailed information about her attacker, Lawrence Singleton. Her description was so accurate that the police were able to create an excellent composite sketch. A neighbor of Lawrence saw the sketch and turned him in. Despite the horrific nature of his crime, Lawrence was sentenced to only 14 years in prison, the maximum the judge could give at the time. The judge expressed a desire to impose a harsher sentence, but the law wouldn't allow it. Mary bravely testified in court, and after Lawrence was sentenced, she had to pass by him as she left the courthouse. In a chilling moment, Lawrence leaned in and whispered to her, "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." 8 years later, Lawrence was released on parole for good behavior, a fact that terrified Mary. By that time, she had become a wife and mother of 2 sons, and the fear that Lawrence would come after her again haunted her. But Lawrence didn't go after Mary. Instead, 10 years after his release, he attacked another woman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes. This time, he unalived her. During Roxanne's unalived trial, Mary testified against Lawrence once more, and her testimony was instrumental in securing a death sentence for him. However, before he could be executed, Lawrence died of cancer in jail in 2001. When Mary learned of Lawrence's death, she felt a mix of emotions. While she felt cheated that he didn't face the full extent of justice, her sons were relieved to know that the man who had haunted their mother was gone. The outrage over Lawrence's early release, which led to Roxanne's unalive, resulted in the creation of the Lawrence Singleton Bill. This law allows judges to impose 25-year to life sentences in cases involving torture, ensuring that someone like Lawrence would never be released early again. And so ends the terrifying and tragic story of Mary Vincent's survival and the chilling legacy of Lawrence Singleton. Mary's strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable horror have inspired many, but her story also serves as a grim reminder of the dark side of humanity. If not for her courage, more lives could have been lost. Make sure to subscribe for more shocking true crime stories, and remember, always be cautious and stay safe. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.